The hashtag for tonight is hashtag Longform Society, and we're hoping that Longform Society members will continue talking about these essays and tonight's panel discussion on the Wheeler Centre discussion forum on the website, and you'll find that forum on the Wheeler Centre homepage. And a few, certainly I will be, and hopefully some of tonight's guests will also be sort of chatting away on that for the next few days. Now, this I assume that many of you will have been to Wheeler Centre events. I'm hoping that tonight will be a little bit more like a book club. By that I mean animated discussion and sometimes moving off topic, or not, at least if not moving off. I don't mean moving away from robots, but possibly not just discussing the articles that were listed, because, as was pointed out in the green room, there was no sex bot piece provided, and that seems like a terrible because it would have raised so many moral questions. So we will, as with any good books, good essays, moving broadly around the ideas that are provoked by the essays, and we're hoping to do this every few months, and each time we do it, there will not just be a different focus of theme, but sometimes it might be that we're picking particular essays or books because the writing is perfection, and other times it is because of the ideas that are generated. And while there is some very nice writing in tonight's essays, it is more about the ideas, I think, than the kind of the literary form of the essay itself. Well, who's not interested in wombats? I was about to say, I love wombats, but also robots. I have sat through the whole of Westworld, even though that my partner abandoned ship and left me to it. I'm still watching Marvel Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. for 4 seasons in. Of course, you know, when you can go back centuries to novels like Frankenstein. When I was a teenager, we had The $6 Million Man. There was 2001: A Space Odyssey, that extraordinary film. The Cyborgs and the Alien series. The wonderful Kim Stanley Robinson novel Aurora, which is about an AI, not a robot, and we'll talk more about the distinction between AI and robots. Recent Ex Machina was a terrific film that looked at some of the subjects raised, and Her is not a film that I've seen, but I know that a lot of people saw it. So not only are robots, particularly AI, everywhere, but they're certainly everywhere in popular culture, which is a separate thing to how much they are actually in our lives. But more and more I'm finding I have conversations with people. I had a friend who works in a bank and his job was to train Winston being an AI, I think, a medical kind of AI, to kind of help people with their financial issues. That was he seemed to need a drink after a few of those sessions with Winston. It was quite slow, I think. Okay, now I would like to remind us all of Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, which were first articulated in 1940, and they are particularly interesting in the context of tonight's essays. The first law is, and this comes from 1940, a robot may not injure a human being or, through an action, allow a human being to come to harm. Law 2, a robot must obey the orders given it by human beings except where such orders would conflict with the first law. 3, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second laws. This I think, quickly leads us into questions on killing and robots, which I know is one of the essays that is up for discussion, and I know that we've probably all got something to say about that, but both Jeff and Mel wanted to talk briefly about that particular essay. Just to remind you, that essay is there's so many. I haven't quite worked out the theatrics of this when you've got 4 long essays and introductory thing. That's called The Use of Robots in War from Chronicle, the moral and sort of looking at morality of robots in the future and their use in warfare. So, Jeff, what did you make of this particular article and the essay and the issues it raises?
I think it's a really good example of how ideological discussions of robots always are. I mean, if you think about it, the vast majority of robots, not only today but throughout history, are actually used in industrial production, and we don't tend to think about that very much, which means that they're to do with one of the most fundamental human relationships, the thing that we spend most of our time doing, which is working. So they necessarily raise kind of questions of power and control. I'm sure we'll come to this at great length, but one of the things that they do is they tend to separate out from that relationship. And I think this is a really good example of it, because if you think about a military robot in isolation or in abstract, it necessarily pushes you towards questions of what is a moral war? How does one conduct oneself in wartime? And that's what the people in here spend all their time talking about. You know, just war theory, when should an autonomous robot kill civilians and when it shouldn't. And they discuss this in terms of making war more ethical. Now, when you're talking about it in the abstract, that all sounds very sensible. As soon as you put it into the real context in which those discussions are taking place, it becomes absolutely nonsensical. When you think about the actual wars that we fight have no relationship to just war theory at all. You think of something like Iraq and the tremendous loss of life that took place in that war. If we as humans can't settle how we fight these wars, the idea that we can program it into robots that somehow they're going to be more ethical seems to be quite ludicrous. But secondly, when you start to think about how autonomous killing devices or semi-autonomous killing devices are actually used, well, as some of the people say in this article, one of the things that they're used for is they facilitate people going into war because they remove the prospect of casualties, which makes it more possible to fight in places like Pakistan, in places like Afghanistan, because there won't be any pushback. And secondly, because they remove the pilots from the field of battle, it also means that there's no prospect for people resisting. So you know that famous Brecht poem about your tank, General, is a wonderful weapon. It has a problem, though. It needs a driver. And the idea is, of course, you know, the driver can say, no, I'm not going to do these things. Well, drones remove that, and as a result, they don't lead to war being more humane. But if you actually look at what happens in Pakistan, that some 80-90% of the people killed by drone strikes turn out to be civilians.
That's right, yeah. I think that...
Sorry, interrupt. I realised I failed to introduce anyone, including myself.
Hi.
That was my name is Sophie Cunningham, and I will be the host over the series, the Longform sessions. Jeff Sparrow, who just spoke, is a Guardian columnist. He does breakfast radio on Triple R, and he's written several books, and his latest book is No Way But This, In Search of Paul Robeson. Mel, who I just cut off rudely, is a journalist, author, podcaster and cultural critic. She's the co-founder of Is Not magazine, and she's currently doing the Rereaders podcast. She's just had a book called The Hot Guy come out, and also wrote a book on fashion called Out of Shape. And Raph Epstein is known and loved by all of us for his work on drive time at the ABC, but he's also an author. And am I right? You wrote a book called Prisoner X a couple of years ago. And so I'm sorry that I failed to introduce anyone. And Mel, if you can remember what you were going to.
Well, I'd be really interested to hear what Raph has to say about this use of drone warfare as well. But of course, this is the first of many pop culture references that I am no doubt going to inject into tonight's debate. I'm a film critic, and so when I was reading this article, one of the films that I was thinking about was Eye in the Sky, which stars Helen Mirren as quite a sort of gung-ho general, and then all these drone operators and the ripples of politicians who are ultimately responsible for the decisions about whether a drone fires or not. And so what it shows is that drone warfare, although it's perceived to be some kind of humanless warfare, is actually intensely human because it requires ethical decisions that are removed from the field of battle and thus cannot really be excused by the idea of some kind of immediate action needing to be taken. There's quite a lot of discussion within this film about whether it's an acceptable ratio of casualties.
Proportionality.
Yeah, that's right. And it's actually quite a devastating film because the bomb does have lots of civilian casualties, which drones always do. But another thing that I was thinking about, this particular
But
article...
do they have more than bombs,
Well,
for example?
missiles. I mean, drones can basically... That's the scary thing as well about autonomous weapons, is that weapons that are not autonomous yet can be retrofitted to become autonomous in the future. Right. So, for instance, on the North Korea-South Korea demilitarised zone, there is a kind of watch robot that is currently under human supervision, but could in the future be reconfigured to operate autonomously and make its own decisions. So there are three kind of relationships that humans can have with these unmanned weapons. So first of all, you can have humans in the loop. That is, a human needs to make the final decision about lethal force. Then there's humans on the loop, which is the humans are merely observing what's going on and that can interfere and prevent the use of lethal force. And then there's humans completely out of the loop, in which the robot is fully autonomous to make a lethal force decision by itself. And that's the trouble, I think, with drones, is that they're only really the thin end of a wedge that is so easy to thicken. But yet what I was thinking about is that what Jeff was saying about just war theory, and the way that it is, of course, completely unrelated to the kinds of wars that get fought nowadays. It's just war theory. If I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't it date back to the kind of like state-on-state sort of total war type scenarios of the past? But now you have these really murky actors that are non-state actors who are like the main protagonists in war.
Well, it's outdated just war theory.
That's right,
Outdated by the way we fight wars now.
Exactly, that's right. And the thing is that it's politically exciting to have fewer casualties. So if you're some kind of politician or a general and you can sell it to Congress or to your home parliament, oh, well, we're not going to have more of our guys being killed because we've got these machines doing the fighting for us. But at the same time, that does remove what Jeff was saying as that human element to the warfare. And it makes you wonder what war is for. Like, is war... just say that there were no humans involved in war at all and it was simply the demolition of resources, you know, like if we could evacuate anyone in a city and then demolish the city, would it have that same power? Is it killing that is what gives war its power? And that putting an army in the battlefield, risking your army, is what makes war powerful rather than having it fought remotely? That's a
good question. What is war for?
Yeah, I know, it's a question of, you know, war. Good God, yeah.
Now, I know that, Raf, you were interested in talking to us a little bit about the a piece on art from New York Times magazine.
Yeah. Can I address the drone thing first?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I did a bit on drones, and I've spoken to people who, when I was at the age, I did 2 years, and I tried to focus on special forces in Afghanistan, which is not easy. And I spoke to a few people who had ordered in drone strikes, and I've read and watched a lot of Jeff's stuff and his concerns about drones, and I guess theoretically I'm sympathetic to the idea that because they're remotely piloted, there's less of a connection to casualties, and there is an advantage in that they don't risk human life. I'm not sure they deserve that much of our attention, that aspect. I do think that is part of it. I've spoken to people who've ordered in drone strikes, and they have insisted to me that they consider that with the same seriousness that they would consider sending their own people into battle. I think, and I'm not dismissing the issues Jeff raises, but I guess the thing that I would like to see people talk about more is something that gets a bit less attention because it's a bit less sexy than drones, and that is the big data. So why are you ordering the drone in? And especially, let's bring it back to Australians. Why is that Australian person not in where they were based, Tirancott? Why are they sort of, a couple of 100 kilometres away? They are there because there's a huge big data scheme. And the industrial scale, which is also something Jeff's written about, the industrial scale of the capture and kill machine escapes most people's attention. So Stanley McChrystal, who was sacked for the Rolling Stone interview, and David Petraeus, who basically spilled secrets to his lover, they set up this ginormous data project that Australia was deeply involved with, and we would sweep into a village, you'd iris scan, fingerprint scan and DNA swab everyone. Right. And you would gather up a whole lot of information, and the question for me, which I guess leans a bit towards my obsession with Google and big data, is, well, who's in control of that data? Who is it being assessed objectively or subjectively? And of
So
course it's being
who
assessed
was-
subjectively.
Who was collecting that information? What government?
Well, the point is that it's kind of its own system. It's not as though George W. Bush or Barack Obama are running the fine-tooth comb over the matrix. You know, I interviewed Ben Roberts-Smith, who's the most highly decorated soldier in this country, and he was telling this quite poignant story about, you know, Anzac Day out in the field in the middle of danger. And he said, oh, we were called out. You know, and I know when he says we were called out, that doesn't mean someone goes, oh, listen, we know there's this really bad guy here. What happens actually is someone gets swabbed by some member of you know, there's 30 different nations involved in that conflict in Afghanistan. Someone gets swabbed or fingerprinted, it sets off a little ping, and it's an automated system. It's kind of like, you know, like in a Roadrunner cartoon. Someone sends a sort of automated message, it lands in the Australians in Tirancott, because they happen to have assets free on the night, and off they go. And we sort of pretend that the laws of war dictate, and, you know, sort of the head of the CDF in Bungendore outside of Canberra makes some decision. They don't. It's like this automatic machine, and it's happening thousands of times across a year, and all of a sudden you've got an Aussie guy on the ground. He's got a drone in the sky that he can call on if he's lucky, because they'd loved having a drone on because it protects them. He might call that strike in, he might send in the choppers, and what's he really basing all of that on? We are supposed to have, and I've spoken to the Australian lawyers about this, we're supposed to have all these rules that make us more cautious and different. You speak to the guys who are actually ordering the strikes, they're like, well, hold on, red flag from the Americans, boom, in we go. So there's this massive machine, it's big data, we submit information to it, we don't really, I've written articles about, you know, police intelligence isn't supposed to merge with army intelligence. It does in that circumstance, even though the AP denies it. So there's a lot going on that is automated, that is about big data, that doesn't get as much attention as a drone. Sorry, that was a long explanation,
Well, no,
but I'm concerned about those things.
It does seem to be all of those things do go together.
Yeah, I
So,
think
I mean,
so.
I can't imagine that the ongoing assassinations in Pakistan would be possible if they were sending in manned troops.
Sure.
So
Definitely.
that's facilitated by the fact that they're drones, but you can't have drones doing the things that those drones are doing without kill lists. With the President and the White House all sitting together drawing up who they are going to kill, and you can't have those kill lists without the big data that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So, I mean, all these people in here can faff on about, you know, their just war theory, but we are talking about the invention of drones facilitating a program of assassination, which was something that once upon a time we thought was a bad thing,
Yeah.
and now it's just taken for granted.
Well,
That's what
I
we
wanted
do.
to ask you guys, this article is from 2015, I think.
It's 2012, I think.
2012, oh my
Yeah.
God. Okay, so this is from 2012. I read a very similar article from last year that was from BuzzFeed of all places, and it was basically following the people who were trying to do drone disarmament, sort of the anti-killbot movement. And one of the things that struck me is that the military are engaging in this arms race, and that we hear a lot about the military-industrial complex. I know I sound like John Connor talking about himself being a great military leader, another pop culture reference, everyone. But we talk about the military as being sort of as if they're operating separately, but Raf, what you were saying is so much like what's going on in the civilian world. And I'm not just talking about national security, although that as well. I'm talking about the way that we inevitably provide data about ourselves in all the smallest things that we don't think are consequential at all, and we don't know how they're being used. Are they being used for good or for bad? I mean, those kind of good-bad things almost seem as archaic as the idea of just war, right?
But I would say that, well, in a way, the link you've made, Raf, is that data is actually being used for drones and for robots, but it is a slightly different data and privacy issues.
But it's the same problem as, I mean, so the small-scale example is the Google car, which is in there, you know. Do you want the car to hit the crowd or hit the wall and kill the driver, right? So we as human beings, we can't really make that decision. But now we have to come up with moral rules for, right, when a computer's faced with that choice, how are they going to make that decision? And I think what's interesting about drones, and it goes back, I think it's that article that mentions the shooting down of the Iranian passenger jet. Yes. We've got systems that are capable of ethical dilemmas that human beings have never had to face before. And I think that's what's really interesting, is the drones bring up ethical dilemmas that we have to plan for, that we are not capable of enduring ourselves. And so it raises a host of fresh questions about different moral situations.
And humans aren't very good at making moral decisions, full stop.
No.
Yeah,
And
well, humans
speak
make
yourself.
weird sort of, we make weird sort of altruistic decisions, you know, like maybe someone might choose to crash their car and kill themselves rather than killing a crowd. But the thing is, if you were forced to sit down and think, what would I do? You might think about it differently. But when you're in that moment where you've got 1 second to decide, humans, I think, do have this altruism impulse, but do artificial intelligences. Because artificial intelligences have had that chance to think it through that humans don't.
Should we talk about, does someone want to answer the question about what the difference between AI and robot is?
Well, for me...
I don't feel able to answer that question, by the way.
Well,
so.
for me, it's about embodiment. Right. So a robot is an attempt to create not just intelligence, but the mechanics of the way that humans move and have physical presence in space. So robots are trying to get across what a human can't quite do, or trying to...
So that's the threshold for you for AI, is it has to be embodied?
Well, AI does not
to
have to have a body. As we saw in the movie Her, where Scarlett Johansson just is a voice. She doesn't have a body.
A honey whiskey flavoured voice.
Yeah, delicious. You could fall in love with such a voice, and indeed he does. But for me, like, the robot is about being confronted with an artificial body, which gives people different emotional responses. I forget which one of the articles this was, but it was. It might have been that old one from 1994.
The Daniel Dennett one.
Yeah, that we were reading. That was about the way that you have to have, like, something that occupies physical space. But I'm interested in your definition.
But that's, I actually found that article really interesting, because I thought...
The 1990, the older one,
to me it seems completely redundant. I think what was really interesting about having the time spread of the articles is what we decide is going to be the definition or the breaking point for artificial intelligence. It's kind of like this ever-receding finish line. And one of the articles mentioned, actually no, it was a John Lanchester article, but say if you brought Isaac Asimov or Alan Turing, so the Turing test's the other big one, right? If you brought them into this room and you handed them, you know, your phone and said, listen, you can fly a shuttle up to the space station with this thing. If I give it to you, you can find your way in any city in the world. You can talk to it and it will do your shopping, as well as, you know, compiling the list. It'll make sure it gets paid for and delivered. By the way, we've got computers that not only read scans better than a radiologist, they read the text of a pathology report better than a cardiologist. They can run an anti-aircraft system and keep a city safe and shoot down a supersonic jet fighter all on their own. I mean, how much would they care anymore about the Turing test? I sort of feel like we've got all of these things in our midst that are, I mean, they're not physically integrated into our bodies, but they are almost seamlessly integrated into our lives. So I'm not sure
What is the Turing? Can you remind us what the Turing test is?
The Turing test is if you can have a text conversation. So it's the ex machina thing. Yeah. So he brings Domhnall Gleeson, is that his name?
Yeah.
Oscar Isaac brings Domhnall Gleeson to see his sex bot, essentially, and he wants to know if Domhnall Gleeson can work out that the sex bot is robot or human.
And there's an extra dimension to that challenge, because normally the robot and the human would be separated so that they couldn't visually see each other, but that adds an extra layer of challenge. Yeah. So if you can see a cue that this is not a real person, but nonetheless understand her as a real person, then they have passed the test.
But I personally, I don't have much time for those questions. I'm much more interested in, hold on, every time I ask Google to do something, actually, I'm teaching Google to be AI. That's a much bigger concern to me than how I define artificial intelligence.
Yeah, Google's also training us, and not just Google, but lots of other things. Just last night, I'm thinking about all the different ways in which the way I get information is so different than it was 5 years, 10 years, 20 years ago. I remember when I was a teenager, I needed to get somewhere on public transport. I would call up a phone number. The person at the other end, you could hear them ruffling through papers, looking up paper timetables to plot out my journey on the... It was nice, you know, you actually had a connection with another person. And then there came the point where I was looking up Google Maps and plotting my journey in advance that way. And now I just listen to the sat-nav Google Maps lady.
Jeff, you tried a couple of times to get a word in.
I have things.
You have things to say.
Well, a few things. I found that Daniel Dennett article to be deeply unimpressive, to be perfectly honest. It seemed a very strange...
I picked it.
He's a huge name in the field. But that first section, trying to make an argument about whether or not it was possible to create consciousness, and essentially arguing that, well, because all life is built from, from substances in the world, there's no reason why we can't build it. It seemed to me to be a strangely trivial kind of
that's
argument.
sort of what Raf's
Yeah, I mean, it's
saying.
like saying that, the entire universe is built from atoms. We can build things with atoms, therefore we can build another uniform.
Well,
and then the second bit where he says that, well, having devoted half the article to that point, then says, let's leave that aside, and then goes on to say, well, let's start building a robot that does things and see what happens. And given that we know the article was published in 1994, well, the answer to that is not very much.
What I find really poignant about the effect of progress on the field of robotics is the way that things that were once hailed as this real cutting-edge stuff now seem embarrassing. And we saw that as well with the Google article about machine learning, the way that some of the early machine learning experiments overpromised and were thus turned into a laughingstock. And look, I'm going to talk about the sex bots as well. There have been some early sex bots that were really garnering a lot of buzz, not vibratory buzz.
When you say there were some sex bots, are they available for commercial
No.
use,
There was
or?
this robot was called Roxy with 3 X's, and she was going to be unveiled at a kind of sex convention, like Sexpo, and a sex expo, and everyone was so excited about Roxy. But when the cloth was taken away, as it were, she was just embarrassing. She didn't look attractive. She kept on just saying really crazy stuff, and she didn't even have a mouth that moved. She had speakers sort of in her head, so it was like a talking doll, and it was completely a letdown. And so that's the trouble, is that there's this constant overpromising followed by a letdown, but even the things that were like really super impressive at the time are now embarrassing, almost the same way that, our phones now we think of as being pretty neat, but like I used to think that having a mobile phone at all was the greatest thing.
One of the things I find about phones, and this actually I think reinforces what you were saying, Ref, about how important is the distinction. I mean, I now think of my phone as an extension of myself. There is so much of a memory aid. I mean, I sort of won't go on, but
Google's transforming our memory, isn't it?
Yes, it
Changing
is.
it.
But also my memory is transforming itself, I would also suspect.
No one can help you with that, I'm afraid.
But
do more crosswords.
The New Yorker piece on animal rights and robot rights was partly, one of the questions it did raise was the fact that we need robots to look like humans to take them seriously. Like,
actually,
if we don't take animals very seriously, what is our relationship to the body, or kind of a version of the body? But one of the things it pointed out is that in warfare, sometimes there can be a version that looks pretty much like that vacuum cleaner, the Roomba, but it's for mind diffusing or whatever.
Yes.
And people still got agitated, that people would bond even with those kind of very basic objects. So I don't know that people do need objects to be
But they are all
looking.
I mean, they're all rate of change questions. Everything from the sexbot to the Roomba is, okay, how quickly are we actually moving? So steam engine development to commercial steam engine, I think, is about 100 years. And we don't really know where we are on the timescale. Everyone knows, that they sent the people to the moon, and, you only need a tenth of the power on your phone. But one thing that I think is interesting when it comes to rate of change, and it comes actually from the article that you didn't like so much, when he talks about, well, if you created a human being artificially created with all the same molecules, would it be the same as us? And you think, oh, well, that's impossible. What's interesting to me is that things really are moving quick, and it's quite hard to wrap your brain around how quick they're moving. There was a great example in another John Lanchester article, because I'm a big fan of his. In the 90s, after the Test Ban Treaty, they built a computer the size of a tennis court to simulate nuclear explosions. It cost about $55 million. I think it used the sort of power for about 800 houses. Within 10 years, you could do that on a PlayStation, and it cost about $200. So that's the Moore's law, the progression. So at some point, the one thing that was interesting about that, you're right, poor article, at some point, our ability to genuinely replicate bits and pieces of human beings might become more and more feasible. And if you observe that, you also observe, there's a great guy in my kids' latest National Geographic someone has this rare condition where he only sees in black and white, and he has had a sensor implanted in the back of his head, and it's like a radar, but it has its own sort of audio-visual pickup. It can tell what colour things are, so I could point it at the chair, and it translates the colour into a vibration in the back of his head, and it's got a Bluetooth transmitter, so his friends can send him different colour messages. So at some point where, you know, I feel like we're in the midst of an acceleration that we don't quite observe, and everything around the sex bots and whether or not people are worried about losing their drone because they've formed an attachment to it. At some point, I mean, the reason that article is interesting is we're getting close to a tipping point, aren't we?
I don't buy this at all, and I think it's the wrong way to look at it, because it's positing a linear progression that one moves along and inevitably reaches some point. That's why the question of defining artificial intelligence actually matters, because it's not a quantitative point, it's a qualitative point. At some point, if we say that we've created artificial intelligence, there are moral questions that follow on from that. Turning off an artificial intelligence therefore becomes something akin to murder. And to me, I feel that the question's posed wrongly. Intelligence in that sense isn't simply an incremental addition of the kind of functions that your phone does. It's a social thing.
Exactly, and that's one thing that is it the New Yorker article about are they like animals? That's one thing that I got quite strongly from that, is that, you know, that experiment where they asked volunteers to basically torture a robot and they refused to do it. I don't think that they refused to do it out of any individual moral qualm, but rather out of concern, out of what the other participants would think of them if they had. Because as the author of that article suggests, it's almost like a synecdoche. What you do to a robot says something about the kind of human you are.
Yes,
and no one wants to be that kind of cruel person. And I think that
some people do.
Well, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
And also, look, I'm sorry to bring up the sex bot. No, I'm not sorry. I love talking about sex bots. But basically, one of the arguments against sex bots is that it encourages further misogyny, because if we have the idea of a woman that you can own, a woman who isn't fully human, a woman who can't have agency by definition, then how does that teach people to treat real women? And then, of course, some people say, don't be ridiculous. It's like saying that, you know, I'm abusing my toaster. But isn't that kind of what people were asked to do in that same experiment? Yeah. For me, what is troubling is how easy it is to get used to new scenarios. I think I talked about it last night on Twitter, and I called it situational plasticity. I don't even know if that's a thing. But the idea, it frightens me how easy it is for me to get used to new things without making necessarily those moral and ethical decisions.
Well, isn't that, I mean, your observation, you could turn that into a question to Jeff, because don't we need to answer the moral questions about the Google car and the drone? Doesn't that help you ask or answer the moral question about whether or not you can switch off the artificial intelligence once you finally get there?
No, I don't see how.
It doesn't help?
Well, I mean, okay, so the most impressive technological achievement in the articles that we were looking at is the translation thing that Google has got, which is astonishing technology. People, presumably, everyone's read it. Yeah, the translation back and forth between Japanese and English is amazing. But I don't think anyone is really suggesting that the AI, as they call it, that is doing that, has the kind of abilities that we associate with consciousness.
No, but they're saying that once you can start doing that, then it is likely that you will develop a more serious, an artificial intelligence that we have to take more seriously.
Again, I don't see why that is the case. It still seems to me what they're essentially talking about is, I mean, most of that article is about this very clever way they have of processing big data. That's quite a different thing, it seems to me.
What do you think about the idea of, what do they call it, instrumental convergence, which you might have seen phrased as the paperclip theory, which is that, just say you have an AI whose only task is to make paperclips. What if it decides to annihilate all life on Earth because it creates more materials for it to make paperclips with? The idea is that if you let it pursue its own learning pathway, it takes it in ways in which we cannot possibly control and that can't be anticipated because we can't figure out the way the machine thinks. And of course, some people argue that it's just a thought experiment, the paperclip thing. But do we need to have some Asimov mechanism in place?
But it's not a thought experiment, is it? I mean, going back to the Iranian airliner, that shot down because the human beings, according to that article, 18 of them refused to believe that the robot got it wrong, right? So that's however many years ago, more than 20 years ago. If we're already in that territory, the paperclip example is not redundant. I mean, we're clearly already asking computers to do things, and we've got creations that are out of control. Sure, it might only be, Facebook and Google are out of control to the point where you can broadcast a murder, and we find that incredibly distasteful and unethical. But we have systems that pose great moral
That's a different question, isn't it? I mean, do we have a technology now that is wondrous and can do wondrous things? Yes, we do. Is anyone suggesting that we owe some sort of moral obligation to that technology?
No.
No, we're not. They're two different points.
But are we going to know? Are we going to know when that's switched on, or is it going to creep up on us? That's what I'm unclear about.
One of the things I find in any conversation about technology, though, is that we kind of talk a lot about the technology, say that the murder on what was enabled by Facebook, the live streaming of the murder. But 100 years ago we were having live hangings and there's still live executions in a lot of countries. I mean, I do think that when we talk about artificial intelligence, well, human intelligence is slightly questionable and certainly very complicated. There's a lot of effort going into building robots might be too strong a word, but kind of intelligent machines that, Juicero, I saw you talking about on social media. That's that.
It might have been me referring to Juicero,
was it?
I can't remember.
$600 to kind of, it squeezes juice out of a bag,
yeah.
and the investors are sad because they're realising that people can get their own juice out of bags without paying $600 for it. And so what is happening, certainly in Silicon Valley, I know that is that people being incredibly unambitious in what they are asking from these artificial intelligences. So there's endless, sort of complicated laundry services or catering services or whatever. And it's like if that's what some of the greatest minds in America are getting to, it's pretty depressing.
The greatest and also like the worst minds in America because they're so narrow in their demographic, really. They're almost all male, young. Think about things like Soylent. Jeff, you've written brilliantly about the kind of weird process of thinking that, eating is just something that humans do surplus to their role within capitalism, so why not just get rid of that and feed them slurry instead? It's like the name Soylent is richly
At least it's not human.
And, yeah, that's right. At least it's not people.
At least it's not the Soylent Green Soylent.
Well, I thought that Google article was really interesting in that respect because the achievement of that team is astonishing, that the technology is phenomenal, but there is something deeply creepy about it. The internal culture of Google seems little short of a cult to me. And reading that article, okay, it's great that we can translate things from one language to another, but it goes back to what Raph was saying, what is happening with all of this data? What is it going to be used for? Actually, it's going to be used to sell things to advertisers and to monitor us.
I think I would say, though, that not disagreeing exactly that Google is a cult, that corporations are cults.
Yes.
So I've just been living in San Francisco for 18 months and everyone says, technology, the tech heads are ruining San Francisco. Corporations are ruining San Francisco. And before there were all these big technology organisations, there were other corporations. And Lululemon is a kind of horrendous cult. If people don't buy their sportswear, I say to you, it's kind of like a real... it is a cult. There were some murders when I was in the States where people would try to get promotions and murdering each other.
In Lululemon?
In Lululemon, yeah. I just think it's partly... In a way, it's a point about capitalism that corporations are increasingly becoming very particular organisations, and yes, we're entrusting them with creating.
I'm not sure if they're cults, but I think it's fascinating that they're raising all the questions about artificial intelligence, and they're also, whatever ideology is going on there, they're beyond the nation state. They don't pay tax, they leech off our schools and our hospitals and our roads, we have no idea of their relationship with the intelligence agencies other than what they tell us, because the intelligence agencies certainly won't tell us. So personally, I find it both tremendously exciting and quite horrifying what's going on inside those organisations, because you can't but be amazed by the technology.
It's
but
astonishing.
but they're unaccountable in very new ways, aren't they? They're not like the mill owner in the Industrial Revolution who's responsible for the people who comes and works in his mill. They are completely detached from all of the people
But they're
they
not
serve.
all the same. So some of the corporations are working harder to be accountable, and certainly Silicon Valley has been fairly good at standing up to Trump, say, with immigration policies. I realise it's partly self-interest because they employ people from around the world. But
Do you call that standing up, saying something? Is that standing up?
Well, I think the fact that not Elon Musk, the guy who runs Uber, is it? You know, did step back from... No, I'm not saying that he stood up. I'm saying that those kind of... The fact that they understand that they have a role or not in kind of supporting policy.
It's a very self-interested role, though, isn't it? To ensure they keep on getting good talent.
But some organisations, say Uber, appears to have no sense of
Look, I'm
moral
not trying to
centre
make a
and others
particular
kind of-
point about Google. It's just that this article was about
Yeah,
Google,
yeah,
so I described
yeah.
it. But I mean, the bigger point is we can talk about sex robots and we could talk about...
Medical stuff is also...
funnily enough, we haven't talked much about that. We keep coming back to sex robots. But we can talk about that. But what robots actually mean for most people, and what they will mean for most people in this room, is you'll lose your job.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
So-
and not just manual jobs either, not the kinds of jobs that robots do now and that we can imagine them physically carrying out. Knowledge jobs, the kinds of jobs that you think require human judgment.
Economists, journalists,
That's
those
right.
sort of things.
Lawyers. Think about how much of being a junior lawyer is just looking up cases.
Legal discovery, boom,
Yeah.
automated.
And that was the point that I wanted to make about the question being so deeply ideological, because it's one of those extraordinary paradoxes of the modern world. Here is a technology that can do amazing things and should be making our lives much better and should be allowing us to live in comfort. And actually, the way most of us will relate to it is we will lose our job because a robot will take it.
But we don't know what's coming, do we? I mean, 200 years ago, all the 90% of the American workforce would have been involved in agriculture. Now it's 2%. They're all doing different things. We don't know. We're not all... Are we all going to end up like Wall-E, where we're just sort of, floating around in space doing nothing?
Well, Wall-E was
quite well
quite
provided
harder.
for.
The other guys were
right.
weren't moving around much.
Wall-E, the animated film about robots.
You
missed
really
that
should.
one?
It's a fantastic film.
Yeah. But we don't know for sure. Just because our jobs are being replaced, we don't know if we're going to end up with no jobs either.
No, although
We might
I
have
wouldn't
jobs
be betting
building
on it.
robots.
It does seem to be pretty much the consensus of everyone you talk to in most industries that, we're talking about driverless cars doing mass transportation in 5 years.
Do you know what? I'm going to be a bespoke journalist in the future. You'll come to me to get that old-fashioned journalism that the new robo-journos can't do anymore.
That's right. Yeah.
I'll live in my hipster enclave and perform this cool little service. And cars with drivers will be like the horse and carts that you see in the city on weekends, giving tourists a ride. Maybe that's what's going to happen, is that we'll just develop different relationships to the jobs that do exist.
Just back on the definition of artificial intelligence, and I'm glad you mentioned Westworld, because I did think, spoiler alert, one of the really interesting ideas is that and it goes again back to the article you didn't like, the way you give something consciousness is you implant it with some sort of suffering, especially around its child. You give it a consciousness by giving it giving it trauma, essentially. And I did think that was...
Did you think that was a bit Judeo-Christian original sin?
Well, it is a little bit, but I was thinking of it more broadly in terms of, and again it goes to the Daniel Ditton article, if you give them some vestige of experience, is that what makes them different? Because they can already, they can win game shows better as well. There's a computer called, was it Watson? I can't remember his name. It did better at Jeopardy than any contestant had ever done.
Chess.
Well, chess is different. Chess is a mass computational thing, but Jeopardy's a quiz show where you've got to speak to people and all that sort of thing. And a machine did incredibly well and won more prize money than anyone had ever won. So I'm not as
machine? What happened
the machine
on Jeopardy?
did better. Well, because it was all communicating by text.
Right, okay.
But it did really well. I'm not as sceptical as Jeff about how far away we are from artificial intelligence. But I'm intrigued with the idea that if you give it experience or, like that article said, some form of growth, surely that is what leads to consciousness. You know, that thought experiment, if you created Jeff Sparrow in every molecule and every atom and instantly put him next door, he'd be different because he doesn't have experience. That would be the difference. If you don't have experience, you don't have context, hard to suffer, which was the Bentham quote in the New Yorker piece, I think. So, and suffering, I know it's a very Judeo-Christian and Islamic concept as well, to be honest, but it's a little bit Buddhist as well. I mean, suffering is really just experience, isn't it? You need to have some vestige of experience, which might, you know, existentially linked to embodiment. That's what gives it consciousness.
Yeah, well, now we're back to that New Yorker article about those two different philosophical schools of thought in animal rights. So the idea is that each individual animal's suffering must be judged. Is that the Peter Singer method that comes from Bentham?
Yes, well, Bentham talks about Peter Singer, but he questions if you
Singer
take it
talks
to...
about Bentham.
Bentham.
Sorry,
well, I mean,
yes.
there is actually still real Bentham sitting in that glass case in England. Did you know that? They mummified his body.
Did they?
Yeah. And they mummified his head too, but look, it did not turn out well because mummification technology was not
Now,
great.
before we talk about mummification, I do need to go to the audience for questions. Before I do that, I just wanted to ask you just like a very quick answer. Do you get attached to your computers, to your phones, to your... I know that you have one of those vacuum cleaners,
I do,
Jeff.
yes.
Do you become attached to those kind of intelligent objects yet?
Well, I certainly see it as a little sentient pet that I can cradle in my hand.
Yes.
I've found Siri to be intensely frustrating. The kind of technology is not there yet. I mean, obviously, maybe if I chose... What's the Google version of Siri?
I don't know.
Does anyone
Amazon's
know?
is Alexa, is it?
I think maybe it's just like OK Google or something, but maybe that one's smarter than Siri. Siri still doesn't satisfy me that I'm having a conversation. But yes, indeed, I do.
Yes.
I don't feel emotionally attached to gadgets at all, to be honest. I'm far more enamoured with the inanimate. Like I've got Zadie Smith on my bedside table, and I sort of love that.
We all
the book.
like that, I think.
Intelligent and beautiful, but I'm far more attached to. And another book I read this year called Nathan Hill, The Knicks. I'm far more emotionally attached. And I'm not my phone's just a...
Every time I give up a computer, I get quite sad. After
Do you
spending
name
2
them,
years,
Sophie?
I name my cars, but not my computers.
Now,
Jeff, what's
cars,
your...
Look, I spend a lot of time on...
Fondling your computers.
I spend a lot of time on my phone, and I think it's amazing, and it's amazing the things that you can do to it. So I'm attached to it in that sense. But, you know, I don't feel bad if I drop it, or if I... Well, I do feel bad, but not for the reasons
money,
that you're...
Only because it costs.
Yeah, that's right.
No, okay. No, we do. I do want to move to the audience for question. So wait till the mic comes round.
I can see a hand.
There's a hand, yes, to the left, so about a third of the way along. Oh, sorry, there's one.
My question...
Okay, I can't. Sorry, I can't see the audiences or the hands.
Can we bring the lights up, perhaps? Oh, okay.
Ask away.
My question, I suppose, is perhaps most directed to Jeff, but I would welcome the panel's insights as well. If consciousness is not the stacking up of information or the experience of processing that information, what kind of additional qualities do you think consciousness must have? What would your test look like for intelligence and consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's not an easy question to answer. It's not a trivial question. I guess partly my point is that it's a question that has to be asked before we can really proceed with this discussion. And too often I think the discussion simply goes, computers will get better and better, and one day they will become this thing that we understand as conscious. But I guess I would like to insist on a theory of consciousness that is a social theory. I mean, it seems to me that is the definition of humanity. Humanity is the social animal, and consciousness comes from language and from culture. And too often these robot articles are presented almost as a kind of Robinson Crusoe story, that you just create this thing and at some point you put enough memory cells into it and it becomes alive. So I don't know really what follows from that. I mean, that's actually quite a difficult philosophical question, and I am no philosopher, but it seems to me it's a question that needs to be posed anyway.
But if it's only culture and knowledge, I mean, you can cram that into a device, and it can deal with that culture and knowledge much better than we can.
But culture isn't an accretion of stuff.
It's
Culture is a
relational.
relationship between people and history, isn't it? That's what
But
human...
they can do that too, can't they? I mean, they're getting... If you can win a game show...
But are
Which
you
they
just
can
putting
do.
are you just putting a certain set of procedures and strategies into play?
I guess I'm not as confident that things like culture, even relational culture and knowledge, are the test. It would seem to me that you're truly conscious when you have the unprompted ability to do both good and bad and be happy and sad. I mean, they seem to me... I mean, they're really difficult to define human qualities, but to be good or bad and to be happy and sad...
To be able to identify yourself as being any of those things.
That seems to me... They seem like the basis of consciousness, which, I mean, is a little bit like,
but see,
do
I mean,
you suffer?
an animal can't be good or bad, can it?
No, I don't think they
they're
quite
not
have the same
self-conscious.
consciousness as us. They are conscious, but they don't have a conscience in the same way that we do. And that is the difference. So they can suffer, it's not quite enough, but if they can be happy and sad, and although mind you, my dog looks pretty happy when it's running in the rain, but if they can be happy and sad, and if they can make a decision about being good and bad, that's the human threshold,
But
isn't
it does lead you... I mean, that's a whole other question about intelligence. I know that birds have an extraordinary kind of spatial... there's something going on if they can fly...
Sure. Well, they have
Yeah.
feelings, but it's whether or not they have
Not
thoughts.
just, not
no?
just feeling, I'm talking about the sort of mapping they can do when they fly across
Yeah.
from continent to continent.
See, for me, I mean, that was what jumped out at me about the article that we looked at about animals and about robots, that one of the problems, I think, is that we have such an alienated relationship with nature, and that comes out so clearly in that discussion of animals, and I think that really hampers our ability
Yes.
to talk about what artificial intelligence might be.
Yeah, because we don't really know what we mean when we say,
anyway,
talk
that's
about
a- that's-
intelligence.
So, well,
I
maybe
think
then-
I probably need to go to the next question
Yeah.
if there is... one over there.
Hey, okay, this is like a bit embarrassing because all the spotlight's on me and stuff.
Yeah, but we can't see you. You're just a voice out of the
Yeah,
darkness.
that's even better. So I have a problem with the way the discussion's being conducted up until this point. Sorry. In that I think for me the first most interesting part about the first two papers that you guys have been discussing, the Daniel Dennett one and the one that everyone's calling the one about warbots, for me the most interesting part about those papers was the virtue ethics point of view. Like, for example, there was something in the Warbot paper about people who were looking after robot dinosaurs and people who were relating to these robot dinosaurs as people, and it seemed to me that there was an ethical thread running through it where we were talking not so much about how we should treat robots, because if you look at the Daniel Dennett paper, you know, machine consciousness is complicated. We can't just look at it as like this like binary thing, you know, without running into body chauvinism or mind chauvinism or whatever, like a lot of prejudice basically against possible machine intelligences. But one thing we can do when we're making ethical decisions regarding the use of robots, which in my opinion are neither good or bad, they're always tools. I think the better way to do it would be to talk about what the use of these robots does to us as individuals, as people. And I find that although Jeff Sparrow in particular I have a lot of respect for, like I've read a lot of your political writing and I love it. I've written for Overland. I enjoy, you know, your entire deal. But I feel like by ignoring the philosophical angles that the first two papers in particular brought up, you're ignoring a great deal of the nuance and a great deal of the ways that we could potentially solve these problems. I'm sorry, this is quite terrifying.
That's okay. Are you saying that
Probably-
we need to worry more about the impact of the robots on us than whether
Exactly,
or not they're
yeah, and
AI?
effectively the reason why these questions are always phrased like this, it's not because It's not because it's a wrong way to talk about it. It's because we're talking about it without philosophy, and specifically, we're talking about it without meta-ethics, which...
I think it's very hard. I mean, I actually totally agree with you that it's very important to think about the impact robots have on us, and the New Yorker article actually goes into that in some detail. I think the article that's about human animal rights, but I do think in this kind of form it is very hard to get down into that kind of nuts and bolts philosophy because there's not enough time, and it's really hard to have those kind of more sophisticated conversations. But I don't think that means that we would just... Well, I don't disagree with your point.
Maybe we can take these conversations to the forum where, in text and being able to consider things at greater detail, we might be able to drill down into some of these.
Do you want us to address that, or...?
You go for it.
I'm not sure that I am addressing your concern, but I think it's a genuine ethical dilemma every time you use Google, because I've got no idea what they're doing with it, but I use Google all the time. So I think that does introduce, and I don't mean to deride the whether or not, how do you define AI as a question, but I'm not as, personally, I'm not as emotionally, it doesn't resonate with me as much. I'm much more interested in how's Google affecting my memory? What ethical choices am I making when I use Google? So I think you're right to a large degree. Ultimately it's how they impact on us, which is also why I was talking about, all those automated defence systems. It is very complicated because we have new moral and ethical dilemmas, and the Google driverless car has a new moral and ethical dilemma. So I think I agree with you if I am understanding what you're trying to point out.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We've only got an hour for everyone in the room, so we probably do need to, if there are other questions. Yes, there's a couple at the front anyway. So who's next?
Hiya. I was wondering what you guys think about brain-machine interfaces. So the new technology that's emerging where we implant electrodes into someone's brain so that they can operate robots with their thoughts. And mostly it's being developed for people who have had amputated limbs or some sort of paralysis or spinal cord injury. But in part, that research and technology development is funded by military. And, currently they're because we want to help our wounded veterans, but also one can easily see how in the future we might be firing missiles with our brains. So what do you think about the idea of when the technology is in us, when we are the robots?
Well, I think that article that Raf mentioned about the guy who sees in black and white, but also senses in with that antenna thing. If you look up the article, the antenna kind of looks like a spout coming out of his head. And he says in the article that it's quite interesting what people compare it to and how that's changed over time. He calls himself transhuman because he thinks of himself as something different to human. Something like, how an insect has antennae but humans don't. So he's closer to being an insect. And it's interesting because does humanity depend on these fleshly perceptive devices and the way that our organic brains work? Or do we become cyborg? Do we become inhuman in a way when we adopt these technologies? Obviously, we would want people to be able to live fuller lives. And I think that you're right to think that it's troubling the way that the military-industrial complex is entwined with such things. I mean, you can also argue that the sex industry has led to a lot of technological development, and that's an industry that's fundamentally exploitative. Sorry, I'm sounding really... I'm sounding much more femo than I meant to when I said that. But it raises for me interesting ideas about our perception of ourselves as human. Are we post-human? Are we transhuman? Are we superhuman? Because a lot of superheroes are these kinds of enhanced beings as well.
And I think the interface is, it's both terrifying, but it just raises, again, a whole lot of really interesting questions. So at some point between coming from Indonesia and white settlement, Indigenous Australians developed a particular ability to withstand, and it's an evolutionary adaptation, to withstand extreme temperatures. So when they get hot, they don't use as much energy. And that's a particular thing that's happened to their DNA. So how different is that fundamentally and philosophically from the augmented human right next to me? I mean, Mel's got glasses.
I do. I'm a
which is,
cyborg.
I mean, that's sort of one of the earliest augmentations that we have. I'm not sure there's a fundamental philosophical difference between that evolutionary DNA change, Mel's glasses, and someone who can, you know, stimulate some bit of machinery. I mean, I think those questions are far more interesting and far more disturbing, because I think no one's going to just go, hey, one day I switched on AI and wow, we've got this amazing thing, whether or not we can turn it off. I think there's a host of ethical questions that, again, it's all good and bad. You know, Tim Berners-Lee also invented the internet. I'm not so sure that it's a bad thing that the military invented the internet. Tim Berners-Lee wanted to share his research at CERN with others, so he thought, hyperlink, that's a good idea. Then I can find out who else is doing things I'm interested in. So I'm not that perturbed by the military's involvement in it. I'm perturbed by what the military does with it. But I think you raise really, I mean, that's...
What do you think about the body horror aspect of this? Because, I mean, a lot of film is obsessed with the idea of the human body being desecrated somehow by cyborg...
I don't know, Jeff's looking pretty prime example to me at the moment. He doesn't look very desecrated. He's pure, you see, he has no digital augmentation.
Well, you never know. He might be wearing contact lenses that you can't see. He might have, like, brain implants that you can't see. Look, I think that pop culture is deathly afraid of this, because it feels like we are being diminished somehow when we add things, even though, like, at the same time they are augmentations.
I just also think that they're kind of complicated relationships between those kind of questions and the people's actual access, really, to those interventions at all.
Well, it's a great example of the digital divide, isn't it?
Yes, there are a lot of people I've been living in America, a lot of people are missing limbs, and I said to someone, what's with all the missing limbs? And a lot of people can't even afford prosthetics, like old-fashioned prosthetics. So some of these kind of conversations, in fact, they are owned by particular sort of organisations that have a lot of money that can allow the kind of people who are part of them to access, and a lot of other people don't have kind of rights or kind of access to any of those kind of
Well, here's an interesting
aspects.
Here's a thought experiment.
Technology.
Are you any more owned by a corporation if your limbs are owned by or patented or trademarked by that corporation than if you rely on Google every day to do your...
Well, you are if you can't get the limb fix without buying certain things. I mean, that's a bit like with food, with modified food, if you have to also buy if you have to rebuy the seed every year. So often there are kind of, most corporate relationships as a way of hooking you continually into the loop, literally as well as in those kind of more subtle emotional ways, I think. Have we got time for one more question? And then I think we'll probably have to leave it and move to the forum.
Hi. I'd like to support the argument for the relevance of philosophic issues in current AI research. But first, as an aside, I'd suggest that Westworld, that marvellous series, is subtler than has been suggested so far. In fact, the origin of consciousness in the Westworld series is not the backstory. That's simply to provide richness. They made explicit reference to a theory of a gentleman called Jane as a philosopher. It was a theory of consciousness called bicameral mind. So, in fact, it's the first of almost any work like this which has gone to those sorts of depths. But to the larger question, the relevance of philosophy to the development of AI, the main track of AI at the moment leads us to ever fancier adding machines. And there are those amongst us, and we've actually mentioned this already, who think that hopefully some way with more grunt and power, this thing will turn into consciousness and something else. Lots of philosophers really doubt that. In fact, there are two kinds of development we need to take seriously here in terms of the further evolution of this. One of them is to have machine intelligence which can do the kind of common sense thing that we can do, and even recent developments like the deep learning advances actually don't take us there. And the second thing is, what's the business of consciousness itself? And how might we actually build that? And I'd actually recommend the 20-odd-year-old Dennett article in terms of thinking about this, or even some recent works of his. This stuff is highly relevant in terms of how we're going to do research to solve those sorts of questions.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a really interesting observation. I'm not sure if... Does any of the panel have a particular response?
Well, I wasn't trying to diss philosophy. Some of my best friends are philosophers. I think in some respects I agree with the point that you're making, but
Well,
I mean,
don't you
this-
think it was interesting in that article, the Google one I mean, the way that even when machine learning, deep learning became unfashionable within robotics, it was philosophy that took it up. Again, that's just an observation, by the way. That was more like a comment really than a question, but great observation.
I think we do probably need to wrap up because we've run a bit over time. Because
Can I
it's
say
such-
10
yes.
seconds? Surely philosophy is what we can draw on. If we've got all these new moral dilemmas, surely philosophy is the guide that we use.
It
Because
is, yeah,
they're the people
certainly.
who've done the thinking about. Even if it's in a new situation, they're the people who've done thinking about ethics.
Absolutely. And I'd like to thank Anne, who's been translating for us all night, and sorry that I forgot to introduce you. And Mel and Raf and Jeff, lots of one-syllable names. I'm Sophie. Thank you very much for coming. And would really enjoyed if you kept the conversation going on the Longform forum. Thanks.
Thank you.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.